Hello everybody, my name is Steven and today we're going to take a look at attaching a welding torch to the CRWeld system. The first component we need to discuss is the torch arm. This is what connects the end effector attached to the robot to the torch that will get placed in this collar clamp. The torch arm mounts to the back of the robot end effector using the two bolts that are threaded into the back of this end effector. So I'm going to go ahead and unthread these two bolts using a 5/32 Allen wrench. I'll go ahead and put these bolts through the back of the torch arm and then bolt it to the end effector. As I tighten down the torch arm, I will make sure it's properly seated in the milled slot. I will now tighten them down. Now that the torch arm is attached, we're ready to put a torch inside the torch clamp. Before you install the torch, it's a good idea to press the E-stop just to make sure the robot doesn't move as you're trying to install the torch. The torch collar clamp has two bolts that you can loosen with a 3/16 Allen wrench. I now need to decide how to mount my torch into this collar clamp. It's recommended that you put the torch in such a way that the 45-degree neck is pointed towards the base of the robot. So what I typically do is I get the collar clamp snug and then I twist the torch to the orientation I want it to be. So now that I have my two bolts snug, I can still move my torch, and I'm going to try to orient my torch so that it's perpendicular with my end effector plate. So I don't want it to be at some obscure angle. I want to have it try to be perpendicular to this plate. And I'm going to do that as well as I can by eye. I'll then finish tightening down on the collar clamp. Once I've tightened down on the collar clamp, I'm ready to route the torch whip. The robot comes with two torch whip mounts that are designed to hold and route the torch whip. During shipping, these are sometimes adjusted out of the way so that it can fit into the box better. So you may need to loosen the straps with a flathead screwdriver and adjust them so that they're facing a correct orientation as these ones are. So the first thing I'm going to do is mount the whip into this first top clamp. So I'm going to give the whip plenty of slack up front before I clamp down here. I'll place the whip in the clamp and then tighten down on the red nut. For the second clamp, I will again give the torch whip some extra slack to get around this corner before putting the whip into the clamp. I will then tighten down on the red nut until the whip is secured. So now that I've secured the whip, I'm going to release the E-stop and I'm going to move the robot around and make sure that the whip has enough slack to not bind up as the robot moves. I'll move the last joint of the robot and make sure the whip has enough room to not bind up throughout the range of the motion of this last joint. And then the next test I like to do is I like to make sure this has enough slack by moving the robot back and forth and making sure it doesn't bind up. Now that we're done mounting our torch, we'll connect the torch to the welding power supply. The first step is to connect the welding contactor cable to the welding power supply. So the welding contactor cable is the 4-pin cable, and you should have the compatible connection for whichever brand power supply you have. For this Miller, the contactor input is inside the box, and I'm going to So now that I've plugged in my contactor cable, I'm ready to connect my torch pin. So I'm going to connect this in the normal fashion. And I'm going to feed my wire into the torch pin. And clamp it into the feeder as normal. Nothing special needs to be done for feeding the wire or handling the gas. It's just like you would with your normal setup. Now that we've connected the torch to our welding power supply, we can begin feeding wire through our torch. So to do that, we're going to use our drop controller. Our drop controller has an arc on-off button as well as a gas button. The arc on-off button serves to arm the arc. If the arc button is off, our gas trigger does nothing. If our arc button is on, our gas trigger will trigger a signal to the welding power supply to feed wire as well as engage the gas. This contactor trigger switch that has the word gas above it is essentially just like pulling the trigger on the torch itself. With that said, you have to be careful to make sure that you don't accidentally strike an arc anytime you push this button. Now that we've finished setting up our system, we can take a closer look at how to use it.